So good morning, everyone, and welcome to Progressive Dems monthly forum, this time on the corporate fair share campaign and the state's budget challenges. I'm Peter Enrich. I'm part of the Progressive Dems leadership team and will be facilitating today's conversation with two wonderful, wonderful guests who we're delighted to have with us. And let me just say a couple of process things before we get started. First, many of your faces are familiar. For those of you who haven't been part of these forums before, PDM has been around for something over 20 years now. We're a statewide network of grassroots activists. We work on developing skills at grassroots work, at focusing on a small number of important issues that we really try and develop and campaign on, and on supporting progressive candidates for office at the state and local level. Our focus is exclusively on state and local policy. At times like these, we're all individually very involved at a national level in those concerns, but we think it's important to keep a focus on the important things that can and must happen in our communities and in the Commonwealth to move the progressive agenda forward. We've been doing these forums basically since the beginning of the pandemic as a way to bring people together and to focus on specific issues in ways that we previously had largely done in in-person forums. We're delighted to have you here. You probably saw that this is being recorded, so please be aware of that. And the tape will be available. We'll send out a link to it in a day or two. One request we have found over the years of doing this, that when people try and use the chat as a place to carry on debate and discussion and raise additional issues, it can be very distracting. And so we would prefer that you not do that. If you have questions that you'd like to ask, things that you're not understanding or that you'd like to know more about, please do put those in the chat, and I, in my facilitator role, will try and steer us to those as they fit into the rest of the conversation. So with that, let's get down to our topic, and let me start by introducing our two guests, who, as I said, both are people we've worked closely with over the years and are delighted to have here for this discussion. First, we've got Kurt Wise, who is a senior policy analyst at Mass Budget and Policy Center, which is, if those of you who aren't familiar with Mass Budget, they are the key source of information on everything budgetary, fiscal, tax policy, programs that the state is or isn't running well. They do extraordinary work. I'll confess I'm on their board, so I'm a little biased. And Kurt has been there for a number of years now as their key person on tax policy. He has degrees from UMass Amherst and from Duke. I hadn't known this until I looked at his bio for this, that he also is a former small business owner, which is going to not be irrelevant to the conversation we're engaging in here. Our other speaker is, who I suspect is familiar to a great many of you, is Harris Grumman, who is the executive director of the SEIU State Council, Service Employees International State Council in Massachusetts. He's been in that role for a number of years and has been a really important leader in the SEIU's work representing a wide range of largely low-wage workers inside government, outside government, on the peripheries of government. He has also been just a critically important leader in the broad progressive coalitions that PDM and other groups have been part of. He was one of the founders of the Raise Up Massachusetts movement, but even before that, he led a series of coalitions that took on key fiscal and policy issues. We're going to be talking a lot today about Raise Up's agenda, which is particularly the corporate fair share campaign. And I presume all of you are familiar by now with Raise Up, but in case you are forgetting, Raise Up for the last decade or so has been the coalition that has brought together a wide range of progressive groups, both from the labor movement, from the faith movement, from community organizations like PDM, and has achieved just remarkable successes. It's the source of the paid family leave program. It has been responsible for repeated increases in the minimum wage. And most recently, most recently still, it was the group that led the multi-year campaign for the fair share amendment to the state constitution on the personal income tax, which I'm sure you all have been following how tremendously valuable that has proven in bringing in more money than we even anticipated for education and transportation in the state budget. So today's topic is, what are we going to do about the present fiscal situation that we are facing, and particularly, what is the corporate fair share campaign? How does that fit in? But I think the place I want to start is by turning it over to you, Harris, and just asking you to set the stage about what the state's fiscal situation is looking like as we're starting to move forward on the 2026 budget.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Peter, and thanks everyone for joining this morning. Says yes on one. That's not the auditor. That's fair share back in 2022. It never goes out of fashion, this shirt, because it keeps coming at us, the good news. So anyway, I represent the Service Employees International Union, but obviously with a broader view of, we are very much a union committed to justice for all, we call it. And we have 120,000 members in the state, as I said, mostly low wage. And the biggest block of them, 80,000 of them, are what we call direct care workers in the private agencies of the state. And what that means is these are people who do real hands-on care, like home care for the elderly and people with disabilities, mental health care and substance use care, developmental disabilities, all kinds of things, through group homes and private agencies and things like that. It's a very important workforce. And so I look at the situation very much from that point of view, but I don't think that's just a union focused point of view. I think that's really structural, because first of all, a lot of people don't realize the care, health and human services is the largest part of the state budget. And it also is an area with, you could say, life and death consequences for people if it's not adequate. And so I think it's a very worthwhile thing to look at. And it's in our direct care system, particularly the direct care system, is in what I call a triple crisis right now. It's a triple crisis because last year was already in a severe crisis, a shortage of workers. We have incredible decline of our workforce. And that means vacancies in very important facilities like nursing homes and group homes of up to 35% vacancy, which means people are at risk for their lives. It also means the workers have to work like triple shifts on Christmas Day. And the reason for this is quite simple. The pay is too low for the state of Massachusetts. The non-union workers in this area, so there's even another 100,000 workers beyond the 80,000 we represent. The non-union workers make $18 an hour. The union workers make $21 an hour. Neither of those wage rates are sufficient to rent an apartment you can live in this state anymore, even in the gateway cities, even as far out as Springfield. This is why we have a mass exodus of people from this work, either out of state or away from the centers that need it most, like the eastern part of the state, or into other work because we call it the Walmart syndrome. I mean, I went down to Walgreens. It's not Walmart, but it's very similar. And one of my members was working the cash register. And I said, oh, you took a second job, to pay the rent. And she said, no, I make the same money here and I don't take the heartache home with me like I did. She said, so I quit. And I was like, well, and she was a great care worker too. So, this is a very serious crisis. This was a crisis before Trump was elected or anything like that. So that's why we looked at this corporate fair share campaign. And you'll hear a lot more about that from Kurt, who really knows the ins and outs of it. But basically, we said this is the easiest and most popular and the fairest way to raise revenue to help give these workers a boost, okay? Because the other thing, these workers aren't, this whole care system, which is the biggest part of our budget, is not benefited, unfortunately, by the Fair Share Amendment, which has done wonders for education and transportation, but it's earmarked for those things. So there is no special stream of money except from the federal government, and I'll get to that in a minute, that helps keep our care system afloat. So the second crisis was in January when the governor came to us and said, look, we've got $1 billion shortfall in the budget. Now, I was like, scratch. It's like, didn't you cut $1 billion in taxes 2 years ago? Seems to me like an interesting sum of money to kick around. But, okay, we did the best we could with that, but that's already happened. And she said, she and her people said, we're going to cut $1 billion from Health and Human Services, mainly from direct care. And so they put forward a budget that really shocked us, cut half of all the caseworkers in mental health in the state. Now, those are the people who do like teen suicide watch and things like that. So that was a shock. They closed 2 mental health hospitals, Pocasset and Pappas, and they capped the home care spending, which has been going up in double digits for years because of our demographics and because we actually are finding people prefer home care to nursing home care. It's also cheaper, but they've capped it. So basically they said, you're not allowed to age anymore. Is what that amounts to. So we were in a crisis mode since January, on top of the crisis mode we were already in. And so one of our arguments is, well, because the fair share money can't be used for it, let's start a new stream of revenue. Won't be earmarked even. We don't need to earmark it. Maybe it'll be used for something else too, or something else later. But let's get another stream of revenue going. So that just made us double down on the need for the corporate fair share. Then the third crisis hit, which was that the Trump administration announced that they were going to push through Congress massive cuts to Medicaid. Now, their goal since Ronald Reagan, the Republicans, has been to eviscerate the progressive income tax at the national level. That is their holy grail, is to wipe out the progressive income tax. And, to them, that's a very unfair tax because it asks people to pay according to their ability to pay, and they don't like that. So, and the only big pots of money to pay for that are either the military or Medicaid. Those are the 2 giant pots of money that the progressive income tax goes into. Medicaid, of course, is also a bit of a stand-in for other aspects of the welfare state, like the food programs and other things that, and other kinds of healthcare and human service things. But Medicaid is a giant place to put money for helping people, for care for people. So since they won't touch the military, that means that they're going after Medicaid, and they've been threatening to cut Medicaid by upwards to $1 trillion, which would be unprecedented and massively destructive to that system. What it means for the state of Massachusetts is we lose billions of dollars of federal money that keeps our health and human service system afloat, because that money goes to everything I just talked about: home care, nursing homes, mental health and substance use. All of that gets funding from Medicaid. So suddenly we're faced with an apocalypse of these things. Now, we have been in this situation before where we're faced with a double problem, basically, which was back in 2002. We were faced with a big drop in our budget here. They cut taxes too much, and we hit a bit of a recession after 9/11. And suddenly there was a shortfall at the state level, combined with George W. Bush's attacks on Medicaid and other federal programs. in order to cut taxes for the wealthy again. It's the same old story. And so we fought back in this state. An earlier iteration of Raise Up Massachusetts, we called it the Stop the Cuts campaign that year. Basically all the same players. We fought we had no reserves at that time in the state. So we fought for revenue. And we said we need at least $1 billion in new tax revenue. And it must include taxing capital gains the same as wages. Now, what does that mean? Well, long-term capital gains in 2002 were taxed at 0%, basically. So that meant that when the Associated Partners who owned the Red Sox sold the Red Sox, they made $800 million profit from the sale and paid 0% in state taxes. So we said tax it the same as wages. If a burger flipper is paying 5%, then they should pay 5%. Okay. When we brought that up, everybody said that's off the table. Speaker Finneran at the time, I don't know how many of you remember him, but he was like, no way, forget it. And then the cuts kept getting worse and worse and worse. And he knew that. He knew that the conversation would get around to taxes. He didn't know it would get around to the capital gains, but he actually admitted that the work we did as a coalition was so powerful that taxing capital gains the same as wages became the most politically viable option, quote, Tom Finneran. Okay, so they passed it, and that saved a lot of cuts. But it also did another thing, which is that the capital gains in subsequent years came in so hugely, like up to $1 billion a year in new revenue, just from what we did on capital gains, that Tom Finneran said, let's put a chunk of that every year in the rainy day fund. And that way, next time this happens, we'll have a big reserve that we can use instead of having to just raise taxes. Well, lo and behold, we have a $9 billion rainy day fund now. And 100% of that, every dollar of that is the work of this coalition. Because without that capital gains victory, there would be nothing in there. So that $9 billion is ours. I mean, we have a right to say we should use that. So what we're saying now is we need corporate fair share to get new progressive revenue that should be done. And we need to use reserves because of this federal threat. We'll probably know in a couple of weeks how much they're going to cut Medicaid. Sounds like around 600 billion is the new number they're playing with. That's devastating for this state and for every state. So basically, we want to reinvigorate that kind of campaign. We call it, revenue and reserves, and we want to flip the script on the Republicans in Congress and Donald Trump. I mean, they want to cut care for people in order to give tax breaks to billionaires, and we want to ask billionaire multinational corporations to pay a bit more so that we can provide care for all our people in Massachusetts.
That was a tremendously helpful stage setting. By the way, Harris and Senator Pat Jalen wrote a wonderful piece that ran in
Commonwealth Beacon.
Commonwealth a few weeks ago. We should put a link to that up.
Yeah,
it tells some of that 2002 story in a powerful way. I think we want, before our hour is out, we want to come back and talk a little bit more about the stabilization fund, when the time to turn that into a big campaign issue is, and some of the dynamics there. But I think first we want to focus in on the corporate tax piece of the campaign, the corporate fair share campaign, and fill you all in a little bit more about that, because we're going to have an ask. We are trying over the next week or so to reach a majority of the legislature co-sponsoring that legislation. We're almost there. We'll talk more about that a little later, but we want to recruit all of your help in getting us over that hurdle. So we want to take some time to fill you in and make sure you fully understand what's going on in the world of corporate tax. it risks getting a little technical, and this is the work that I've done for the last 40 years of my professional career. And we can give you as much detail as people want, but let's start. Kurt, if you could just explain, what is the problem? What's wrong with our present corporate tax?
Great. Well, thank you, Peter, and thanks to PDM for having me here today. Yeah, so I guess I want to focus on this, the element of the fair share, corporate fair share campaign that is around something called GILTI, Global Intangible Low Taxed Income. And so what is that debate about? Basically, writ large, it's about stopping large billion-plus-dollar multinational corporations from avoiding the taxes that they should be paying to Massachusetts. Arriving at that happy outcome is something that can be achieved through a relatively simple set of changes to our tax code. And were these changes to be adopted, which is what the campaign is all about having happen, Mass Budget estimates that the Commonwealth would generate hundreds of millions of dollars a year in additional revenue coming from these very large multinational corporations that currently are engaging in aggressive, abusive tax avoidance schemes to avoid paying taxes that really are their responsibility to contribute to the Commonwealth. Peter said that there's a lot of technical aspects to this. I'm going to try and avoid most of that and keep it at a pretty high level. And we can certainly dig down to deeper to the extent that people are interested in those things. But it's worth spending a moment talking a little bit about multinational corporations, just describing what that is as different from sort of smaller Massachusetts-only businesses and or businesses that operate only inside the U.S. So a multinational corporation is more or less what it sounds like. It's a corporation that has operations in overseas. Often there will typically be a parent company. For our purposes, that parent company is one that's headquartered here in the United States. And this parent company will have established subsidiaries, smaller businesses that it's sort of carved off. These can be located throughout the US, but for a multinational corporation, some of them will also be overseas. And in many cases, these are subsidiaries that have been established in tax havens overseas, very often with the specific purpose of helping these tax avoidance schemes. So, some of these large multinational corporations can have dozens or even hundreds of subsidiaries overseas. So these are, complicated businesses. And I think an important feature to keep in mind is that even though it's composed of dozens or hundreds of subsidiaries, it operates at the top level as a single business. And so, some of the reasons for having these different subsidiaries is to create efficiencies and et cetera in different ways. But one of the outcomes is that the entire purpose is to generate the largest profit possible for the group as a whole. And that one of the ways that these multinational corporations achieve that is by very subtle, complicated, and aggressive tax planning that allows them to use these different subsidiaries in ways that reduce the tax exposure of the group as a whole. So how does that work in the case of GILTI? So basically, this boils down to something called international profit shifting. And what happens is that the profits that are generated in the United States by subsidiaries or the parent company located in the United States are shifted out of the United States for tax purposes. And these are very often shifted to these tax havens that these multinational corporations have set up subsidiaries in. So these can be rather complicated schemes, and sometimes less complicated. But the net effect, given the way that the U.S. tax code is written, is that once these profits have been shifted off the books of U.S. Businesses and onto the books of these subsidiaries and offshore tax havens. For all intents and purposes, they exit the U.S. Tax system. They are no longer easily taxable by federal or state tax authorities. So, what is an example of this? A simple and common example that's used of this is the large parent, the corporation, whatever it is, say it's Pepsi-Cola, establishes a subsidiary in, say, the Cayman Islands. And the sole item that sort of is housed in the subsidiary is the brand name of Pepsi-Cola. And then the parent corporation pays this subsidiary for the right to use the brand name Pepsi-Cola, which has the effect of transferring, hundreds of millions, potentially more dollars from the parent corporation's operation in the United States onto the books of this subsidiary, which is doing nothing more than owning and licensing this trademark back to the parent corporation. As a result, profits are shifted out of the United States, no longer taxable by U.S. Or state tax authorities. So this is a big problem, a very big problem. It's recognized by tax experts and tax authorities all over the world, including here in the United States. And it's worth spending a moment talking about how big a problem this is, just so we have a sort of get our arms around the scope of the problem. It is a very big problem. There are very large sums of money being transferred out of the United States onto the books of overseas subsidiaries. So just a couple of data points here. An analysis of a 2024 report from the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis finds that U.S. multinational corporations booked some 45% of their $1.33 trillion of net foreign income to subsidiaries in just 12 low tax jurisdictions. So, these are very large sums of money that are being booked to tax subsidiaries established in tax havens, overseas tax havens. Another example, 2021 study produced by the U.S. Department of Treasury notes that more U.S. profits are housed in tiny tax havens than in the major economies of China, India, Japan, France, Canada, and Germany combined. So we're talking about, just on the face of it, sort of a ridiculous situation where tiny tax havens, Cayman Islands, Bermuda, a handful of others are in theory generating more profits for these U.S. multinationals than these U.S. multinationals are generating in the world's largest economy. So just on the face of it, that's ridiculous. A final thing, just another example of how crazy this can be and sort of bald-faced. One 5-story office building in the Cayman Islands was the legal business address for almost 19,000 companies. So, again, this basically it's a bunch of letterboxes, right? That, establish a legal presence for, some subsidiary, but there is no meaningful, productive work happening for these multinationals in these places. They are purely there for the purpose of shifting income out of the U.S. and avoiding these taxes. So where does GILTI come into this? GILTI is part of the solution for addressing this kind of abusive tax avoidance. The federal government created in 2017 as part of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act a provision that tried to address this kind of aggressive profit shifting. Basically, the GILTI provision establishes a process, which we don't really need to get into all the details of, but it allows for the identification of profits that very likely have been shifted out of the U.S. Or shifted internationally to subsidiaries in tax havens. Then, based on sort of the U.S.'s share of total global economic activity, the GILTI division assumes that 50% of these profits that have been shifted to these subsidiaries and tax havens originally came from the United States. Basically says, look, there is, billions and billions of dollars that have been shifted to these tiny tax havens based on how much of global economic activity happens in the US. We, the US tax authorities, are going to assume that 50% of those shifted profits came out of the US. And now when you, the multinational corporation, perform your tax calculations, you are going to need to include that 50% back into your base profits from which you, then perform your tax calculations. So, we're talking about, again, hundreds of billions of dollars a year that, as a result of GILTI, are getting pulled back into the corporate tax base in the United States. States have the opportunity to piggyback on this federal code and require that for state tax calculation purposes, this same 50% of shifted profits is included in the state tax calculations. That's not the same thing as all of that profit being taxed by each state. There's a mechanism for dividing those profits among the states. So the states are only taxing the portion of that total US profit that is reasonably assumed to have occurred within each state. But so, some dozen or more states piggyback on the state code for taxing GILTI profits. In New England, 4 of the 6 New England states adopt the full federal approach, requiring inclusion of 50% of these shifted profits back in the state tax calculations that these multinational corporations are performing. Unfortunately, Massachusetts, in a somewhat mysterious but certainly problematic move, as part of a mid-year supplementary budget back in 2018 in an outside section, so a small sort of seemingly technical change of this supplementary budget, the definition of these GILTI profits was adjusted in a way that results in Massachusetts requiring the inclusion of only 5% of these shifted profits rather than the 50% that many of our neighbors and many other states and the federal government require that multinationals include. So, as a result of that change, these multinational corporations have a much smaller profit base on which they are calculating their Massachusetts profits, and consequently, they're calculating their Massachusetts taxes, and consequently, Massachusetts is losing out on hundreds of millions of dollars a year of corporate taxes, specifically from very large multinational corporations that are choosing to aggressively shift income out of the US as a way to avoid taxes. So the goal of the Fair Share campaign, this element of the Fair Share campaign, is simply to return to the federal approach of including 50% of those GILTI profits in tax calculations. I think it sort of brings us up to, provide some background and brings us up to what the campaign is about. There's more we can talk about that, including which kinds of businesses are affected, the size of these businesses, et cetera. But I'll stop there and turn it back over to Peter, and we can dig into more of that later as we have time and interest.
Wearing my abandoned state tax professor hat, that was a magnificent explanation of some pretty complicated stuff in what I hope was pretty comprehensible terms to people. So thank you. I want to take just one very short detour because, as many of you know, another one of PDM's priorities, other than fixing our tax code, is fixing our legislature. And I do want to just emphasize the piece that Kurt told about how we got into this mess in Massachusetts. This was a measure that was done in 2018, so these complicated changes were made to federal tax law in 2017. In 2018, before state tax people really had much understanding of them, someone got to the leadership of the House and got them to insert this very technical language into an outside section of a supplemental budget in the dark of night that redefined guilty as a dividend. Only if you were pretty sophisticated would you understand that the effect of that was going to be to give away 90% of the revenue that the state was otherwise entitled to, an amount of revenue that at that time was not recognized to be nearly as substantial as it now is. The legislature's revenue committee, there had never been a bill filed on this. The legislature's revenue committee knew nothing about it. The legislature, as far as I can tell, when they voted on it, knew nothing about it. This happens repeatedly with important pieces of state policy in general, state tax policy in particular. It's part of why our campaign is seeking both to re-empower the subject matter area committees, which presently play very little role in a great deal of state policy making, and to recreate something that Massachusetts had for many years. We're now the only state in the country that doesn't have an independent research capacity in its legislature that reviews fiscal impacts, that analyzes legislation, that assists legislators in pursuing their own initiatives. So we are working on a bill that would restore the legislative research and fiscal analysis bureaus, and we're working on how you reform the way the legislature does its work to re-empower committees so there's an opportunity for public input and review and expert input and review before laws get changed in the dark of night. So not today's focus, but we'll be back about that. It's part of the secret to how this all goes awry. So Kurt, I wanted to come back to one piece that I think is really important to clarify. And I come back to the fact you were a small business person. How is this going to affect smaller businesses and businesses that operate primarily in Massachusetts, primarily in the US?
Right, great question. So unless a company, corporation has overseas subsidiaries, and specifically overseas subsidiaries in tax havens, and further is aggressively shifting income out of the United States onto the books of those overseas subsidiaries, this is a change which has no connection to the business. So basically, businesses that are operating only in Massachusetts, regardless of their size, businesses that are operating only in the United States, regardless of their size, would be entirely unaffected by this change. It is only multinational businesses that are aggressively shifting profits to tax havens overseas. I mean, I think just a few sort of data points which are interesting and useful to note on this. Looking at IRS data, the most recent IRS data we have available, which is from 2021, and very likely, the situation has become even more concentrated and the numbers even larger since then. But in that year, U.S. multinational corporations reported to the IRS $610 billion in guilty profits. So we're already talking about $1.2 billion of shifted profits, internationally shifted profit, because we're only pulling 50% back into the US. But so we're talking about a very large sum, $610 billion that they reported in guilty profits. So that's money that's being pulled back into the US tax base. That money, all of that money is from less than half of 1% of C corporations. So in that year, 1.5 million C corporations filed with the IRS. Fewer than 7,400 of those 1.5 million corporations reported any guilty. So we're talking about a tiny minority of corporations that would be impacted by this. And, two last sort of data points. Almost 95% of that guilty was reported by multinational corporations with over $2.5 billion of assets. And almost 98% of it was reported by multinational corporations with over $500 million in assets. So we're not talking about small businesses. We're talking about a very small handful of very large businesses engaged in abusive tax avoidance. So now, small businesses in Massachusetts this has nothing to do with them apart from the ability to generate hundreds of millions of dollars in additional revenue for the Commonwealth that helps support all the things that all of these businesses rely on: good roads, good education, healthy workers, you name it. So that's how it affects Massachusetts businesses.
Also puts smaller businesses at less of a competitive disadvantage to
Absolutely.
their huge competitors who don't have to take state taxes into account as part of their cost of doing business.
Absolutely. Good point.
So I want to turn to the question that Charlie put in the chat and come back to you, Harris. Talk to us about where we are politically in moving this forward, what the strategy going forward is.
Right. Well, I mean, I guess again, just to reiterate what I said at the beginning about why we chose guilty as an approach. And of course, let me just say one thing. Guilty is an acronym. We all know what the word guilty means, but the acronym means global intangible low taxed income, which describes basically where this money is in low tax havens, and it's global, and it's hard to put our hands on. It's kind of intangible. That's why it has that funny name, but of course it also is supposed to evoke the moral aspect of that. And it's also, like I said, it's easy because the feds do it already, as Kurt said, and because our neighboring states do it. It's fair because of businesses. And I just really want to say, I mean, we forget that just like there's a 1% in income and a 99% in income, which is basically how we came up with the millionaire's tax, a fair share on income, to deal with the problem that it's the 1% who've been benefiting from all this, whereas the 99% have not. It's the same in business. There's a 1% of businesses like Amazon who are taking advantage of these things and really socking it to the 99% of businesses who, struggle from quarter to quarter to keep their doors open. And so it's a very similar dynamic. And that's why the term fair share applies equally to both the business tax and the income tax we already did. And I think that's an important thing. And it's why this is such a popular thing, too. When we polled on it, we usually get 80% saying, I support that, which is the highest thing on taxes I've ever seen in 30 years. So, it's just a no-brainer. But in the legislature, it's not as easy. They are very beholden also to big corporations. And the governor is, too. And the governor was open to put a few revenue ideas in her budget in January. They were mostly very unpopular ones or very obscure ones, and they weren't going anywhere. I don't know why she did it that way, but that's what she did. But it does show an openness to considering revenue. The House and the Senate are very open to considering it, they've told us. And they're very open to considering this idea because we've really made it clear to them with 88 co-sponsors and already an absolute majority in the Senate of 21 out of 40, that this is something that people will put their names on publicly and vote for. So that's good. But why aren't they doing it yet? Well, you remember my triple crisis thing. They are waiting for the third part of the crisis. They want to be able to say the federal government is going to do this to Massachusetts, and then say that's why we need to do this tax thing. And so even if it isn't, everybody doesn't love it, Amazon doesn't love it or whoever, we have to do it. And so I think the timing, that doesn't mean they're going to do it. That just means that's how their minds think. We've seen it before with 2002 and other times, even with fair share, getting them to vote to put it on the ballot. So we need to keep the pressure up and get a majority in both chambers on it and get as many people supporting it as possible so that when the time comes, it will be like 2002 and they recognize that this is the most politically viable option to get real new revenue in. And if you get real new revenue in, you can use reserves, at least judiciously, without incurring the wrath of our bond raters on Wall Street and so on. An example of that is just when they do a bond bill, they put up some real new revenue as collateral, say a couple of $100 million, and then suddenly they're borrowing $3 billion, and we don't get any blowback on our bond rating. So it's the same sort of concept. If we need $1 billion or even $1.5 billion to save our state, we can do it if we do this. So I think what we're looking at time-wise is they're doing their budget. The House budget is very interesting because the House budget actually undid most of what the governor did against direct care. It took away the cut on Department of Mental Health caseworkers. It took away the cap on personal care and home care. It took away the closings of the hospitals. Now, that's quite an accomplishment. The problem in it is they didn't really say how they were going to pay for that. And so they kind of, again, left it open for the next stage of the process. The Senate will probably do something similar. So we will have addressed the in-state problem, which I think is a very severe problem. I mean, we're talking about the legislature, but let's talk about our governor a minute. Back in January and February, we at SEIU and in Raise Up were saying, why is she building a runway for the Donald Trump agenda on cutting health and human services? I mean, why is she, basically saying, we'll do it first, and then you can do even more? I mean, it's shocking, appalling. Now, I think she's pulled back from that because there's been such an outcry, and the House has taken steps to undo it. But when the news from the feds come and the Congress is marking up the bills now, I just heard last night that they postponed their markup from May 7th to later because they're having trouble keeping their majority together. That's, of course, one hope we have is that we so scare them about keeping their majority in 2026 that they won't go too far with this, as they failed to do in past Republican majorities. They wanted to gut Medicaid always, and they often have backed off of it. Here, we think they're as determined as they've ever been, but still, you can't undo numbers. So they're finding every way they can to label health and human services as types of waste, fraud, and abuse. So we do think, at least like $500 billion will be in the final bill, and that final bill in the House will be ready by the end of May. That will give us a very clear point. It won't mean they've done it yet. The Senate still has to concur at the federal level, but it means that they will have staked their election future on it, the House members. I mean, because every House member who votes for that, if it passes, has to live with that, whether it passes ultimately or not. So that means they are hell-bent on making sure it actually happens so they don't just get beat up next year for something that didn't ever happen. So we think what happens at the end of May in the US Congress is going to tell us a lot, and it's going to tell the legislature a lot. And then the battle really starts of us getting out in the streets, rallying, talking to our legislators in district, really putting the pressure on to say, you have to now do this revenue and corporate fair share and reserves. And the reserves question will be in proportion to how big the federal cuts are. So the goal right now is to get that number of co-sponsors, that proof of concept that we can get the votes locked in, so that when we go to the Speaker and the Senate President and other leadership in June, we can say the votes are there. What's holding this up? We had to do that in 2002. We had 83 House members on taxing capital gains the same as wages. That's 83 out of 160. We need that now on corporate fair share on the GILTI tax. So that's really where we are in this campaign. I don't know, did I miss anything, Peter, that you think?
No, but that is where we want to turn to all of you and where you actually come into this. And so I'm putting the bill numbers in the chat. And what we hope you will all do is reach out today or the beginning of next week to your senator and your rep and tell them that you want them to move on this, that it's a critical priority, that it's a matter of fairness, it's a matter of need. In the materials for today's forum, we included some fact sheets and Kurt's 10-page long report that really fills this all in, but you don't really need all that much. It's a very simple message. And many of your senators and reps have already co-sponsored. If you take the time to go to the bills and check who has already sponsored, you'll know whether you're thanking them or whether you're asking them. But we really need you to do whichever is appropriate for each of your representatives. It's very much in there. They're hearing about this from other people, but they need to hear about it from their constituents. And we really do want to get it to happen right now. So please do that. We have a few more minutes, and I thought perhaps the next place to go is just to talk a little bit about, so what are the objections? What are the counter arguments that legislators and you may run into on this? Yeah, the other thing, of course, you can be doing is talk to your friends, share the fact sheets with them, ask them to reach out to your legislators. A lot hinges on this. So I don't know if we're going to have time to do this, but I'm aware of at least 3 kinds of arguments that the multinational business community and their allies are raising. And let's see how far we can get in touching on each of them. The first, and Kurt, I want you to comment on this, is, oh my goodness, if we increase taxes on these important businesses, they're going to move out of state and we're going to lose their business activity and their employment. Does that make sense?
No, actually it doesn't. It sort of made sense in a way a year or two ago, but Massachusetts recently changed the way that corporations are required to calculate the share of their profits that are taxable by the state of Massachusetts. And the way that they changed that is to, at their request, they've been lobbying for it for years, is that they wanted and got the only sort of element for determining, the only factor for determining how much of their national profits are apportioned to taxation in Massachusetts to be their sales in Massachusetts, the share of their sales, total sales that are made specifically to Massachusetts. So what that means now is that whereas previously other factors went into that calculation, how much of their total productive assets, warehouses and machinery and inventory were in Massachusetts, how much of their total workforce was in Massachusetts. None of that is part of the calculation anymore. The only thing that matters is the share of their sales. And so effectively, the only thing that they can do, even at a theoretical level, to change the share of their U.S. profits that are apportioned for taxation in Massachusetts is to reduce their share of Massachusetts sales. So in other words, to reduce their sales into Massachusetts. No business, no rational business is going to pursue that as a means of reducing their taxes. So at this point, they got a not insignificant tax break as a result of pushing through this, what's called single sales factor apportionment. But their hands are now tied in this regard. It does not, this is it's guilty, moving to a 50% guilty inclusion would in no way affect their ability, their taxes in terms of their ability to change taxes by reducing workforce or reducing the number of factories or warehouses they have. Doesn't matter anymore. Peter, was that a reasonable explanation? What would you add to that?
To me, that was a perfect explanation. I hope it worked for others. It's probably also worth remembering that a dozen other states, including most of New England, presently taxes businesses this way. It's not like we would be an outlier. We'd be actually joining a behavior of a very large number of our neighbor states. It isn't even a bad business climate kind of thing, but it's certainly not something that moving your assets and your personnel out of state would be of the slightest bit of relevance to. The second objection that's going to get raised, and I'm just going to wave my hands at this because it would take more time than we have to discuss it, is an argument that the Constitution prevents states from taxing out of foreign income, and that this is an attempt to tax foreign income. And I'm just going to assure you, as an expert on constitutional law governing state taxation, which is how I spent my career, that those arguments just don't work. That doesn't mean businesses won't make them. It doesn't mean there won't be some litigation involved, but ultimately they are terrible arguments, and particularly terrible because of the way the Massachusetts tax system is structured. The last one, and we have 1 minute, so I'm going to at least toss this to you, Kurt. Gee, is this really going to bring in enough money to be worthwhile? And I know you've done a tremendous amount of wonderful work trying to figure out exactly how much money it'll bring in, but can you just comment quickly on the how much money will it bring in, how much difference will it make?
So the estimate that we generated working with other national experts is our expectation is that adoption of 50% GILTI would inclusion would generate more than $400 million a year. Now that's what we're calling a robust and well-enforced provision, because these corporations have, are always eager to find new ways to exploit the tax system to avoid actually paying the taxes that we expect them to. But under a robust and well-enforced provision, we expect upwards of $400 million a year from this change in the tax code.
You're muted.
Sorry. We do have to stop because we try and stop promptly at 11 o'clock, but I hope this has helped fill you in on the situation, on the solution, and on what you can do. And we very much hope you will act in the next day or two to help us move this forward. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll be in touch. Take care.